welcome to Alzheimer's Talks, a monthly teleconference series presented by Us Against Alzheimer's, where we connect you with the leaders in research and policy, today caregivers who are working to stop Alzheimer's. Thank you for joining us today to talk with award-winning author Jonathan KOZOL about his latest book, The Theft of Memory, Losing My Father One Day at a Time. With me today is MERYL, a board member of Us Against Alzheimer's, a co-founder of Women Against Alzheimer's, and herself a 20-year caregiver for her physician husband with early onset and her mother with age-related dementia. She herself is an award-winning and best-selling author of a book called Slow Dancing with a Stranger, Lost and Found in the Age of Alzheimer's. 100% of the proceeds from that New York Times bestseller are contributed to Alzheimer's disease research, and we thank MERYL for her generosity in doing that. MERYL will be leading the discussion today with Jonathan.
Thank you, George. Today we're so excited to welcome Jonathan KOZOL to this special edition of Alzheimer's Talks. He is the award-winning author of Savage Inequalities, Death at an Early Age, and many other books from his 50 years of working with the underserved children and families in our country. His newest book, The Theft of Memory, Losing My Father One Day at a Time, chronicles his experience with his father's Alzheimer's disease. Jonathan, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks. It's good to be with you.
Many listening in have their own stories to tell about Alzheimer's bottled up inside. As an acclaimed author for your works, what was the internal conversation you had with yourself about the pros and cons of writing such an intimate story?
Well, I really didn't have to make up my mind to write it. It wrote itself. At the time my father was dying, he lived until just 7 years ago. At the time he was dying, I just found myself writing about those last years of his life without even thinking about it, almost like keeping a journal. And then after his death, I just kept right on for the rest of, for about a year. And at that point, I set it aside because I wanted some perspective. And I didn't come back to it until 2 years ago. And then and at that point, by that point, I'd also read, my father was a doctor and a neurologist, and by that time I'd had a chance to read files and files that he'd left on his own career, in which he had been a specialist in brain degeneration, here affiliated with Harvard Medical School. So at that point, I felt it was okay to finish the book at that point.
He was diagnosed in 1994. Contrast awareness today of the disease and back then, and you write that your father hid the diagnosis from you, the doctors, and even your mother, Ruth, for more than a year and a half.
Well, I don't think things were too different in this respect from today. It was one evening in 1992, my father, he was 86 then, sat me down in his apartment in Boston and described to me attacks that he'd been having. He called them amnestic spells. And he also spoke of periods of interrupted consciousness. And drawing on his own 60 years of experience as a neurologist, he diagnosed in himself the early indications of Alzheimer's. 2 years later, the diagnosis was confirmed by one of his former students who had since become one of the leading neurologists in Boston. And 2 years after that, I had to put him in a nursing home.
Jonathan, denial by both patients and families is so prevalent, and your father is what you describe as his fascination with his predicament, this sort of inner life, was how you connected with him through the disease progression. How much of it was trial and error, and what did you do to try to stimulate that engagement?
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, I might say even after he was in the nursing home and well into the early stages of dementia, he continued to describe his illness as if he were a doctor observing himself. At the same, it was almost as if he were simultaneously the doctor and the patient. It's fascinating the way he did that. But the key thing from my point of view in talking with him was, first of all, continuity. I had to make certain I could follow up one conversation with the next one the next day, next night, or within a short period of time, so that we could build from one conversation to the next. Second thing is, I'd known him for so long that even when he said something that didn't seem to make sense at first, I could pick up one word or one phrase that I knew had some significance in his life. And if I repeated that or asked him a pointed question, it would suddenly elicit a whole broader expanse of memory on that subject. But I think the most important thing was that I always had what I call real conversations with him. That is to say, and this was true also of the helpers I hired to be his companions when I wasn't there, it was important to me to say real things to him. And he'd always had a charming gift for repartee, and that didn't abandon him completely for a long time. So I would, if he said something rather strong with which I disagreed, I would say, I don't agree with you on that. Tell him why. And it would, in other words, all my conversations with him carefully avoided that kind of sing-song nursery tone that people too frequently adopt when they talk to people in a nursing home or talk to people in a, who are in early dementia or late dementia, for that matter. The way people often talk to me. Go ahead.
You bring up that point of really an annoyance with how elderly people are treated as if they're not physically present or they're unconscious. And if you don't mind, I'll quote from your book. In your book, you write about someone who was visiting, and they said, "You're lucky to have had your dad with you for so long. It's going to be hard for you to lose him after the funeral." I cringed to hear her say this. She was sitting only a few feet from my father. Up until that moment, he'd been looking at his lap and did not appear to be attentive to the conversation. But at those words, he suddenly looked up and said, not to the woman who had said this, but to the room in general, "Is someone speaking of a funeral?" And you also spoke about other times where people spoke as if he wasn't there. Is that endemic to the treatment of Alzheimer's patients from your experience?
I don't know for sure, but I have the impression that it's quite common, that either talking across the patient as if he weren't there, I'll say he because it was my father, either talking across him as if he's not there, or else saying things that would be terribly upsetting to the patient, as if he can't hear. And in this case, this was a woman who I didn't know that had come to a birthday party we were having for my father in the nursing home, his 95th birthday, and she apparently had known him long ago, and this was like a dutiful visit on her part. But, boy, I wish she hadn't come, because she was sitting right near him, and she talks right across the room to me, and says, "After the funeral, Jonathan," as if she's, and my father immediately said, "Is someone speaking of a funeral?" I got up right away. I went over to my father. I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "Daddy, people say a lot of stupid things." In contrast, the helpers that I hired, the companions I found for him, and I ultimately brought him home to his apartment, and then I needed more companions. These were terrific people who never spoke to him in that artificial way. They talked to him directly, and amusingly, and sometimes he'd say something funny, maybe not intending to, and they'd come right back at him with something funny. They kept that smile in his eyes. They kept him alert, and I think that's crucial to do. One of the people who particularly was particularly fond of my father was with him at a time when I brought my dog to visit him. I had a golden retriever, and she loved the dog, and she was petting the dog, and she looks up at my father and says, "This one is an angel," meaning the dog. This one was an angel. My father didn't miss a beat. He immediately said, "I'm not sure I'd go that far." And she looked at him and said, "What is she, doctor, if she's not an angel?" And my father said, "Practicing to be an angel."
I think
that's totally important
for those moments.
Keep the wires humming.
Your mother was 2 years older than your father in relatively good health. Can you explain the dynamic and the challenges when your father, because of a fall, had to be institutionalized, and what it did to your mother?
Good question. My mother had grown a little scared of my father before he went to the nursing home because he was growing terribly restless and gesturing in ways that scared her a bit, as if he might become violent. But after he'd been in the nursing home 6 years, he started asking me, kept asking me, "Is it time yet to go home? Are we going to go home now?" He'd do that repeatedly. And people in the nursing home, said to me, "Well, he's in dementia. You can ignore that. He doesn't know what he's saying." But I thought, I'm going to take him at his word. I think he does know what he wants. So I brought him home to the apartment with my mother was living there. And but before I brought him home, I asked my mother if she could handle it. And he wasn't so restless now. He was more tranquil. And she looked at me right away and she said, "I want him to come home. I want him to live out his life here." And I brought him home. It was quite extraordinary. They had lunch together. Even when he needed help eating, they still would have lunch together. He would sit at a desk in his living room, which had been his office desk for 60 years. And he had a real look of pride and dignity sitting there. It was quite a moving experience for me. And my mother was happy he was home. She couldn't get the conversation from him that she enjoyed, but her helpers would, after Daddy went to bed, her helpers would talk to her at length. She was a little older than my father. She died before he did, a couple of years before him. In 2006, at the age of 102, and then my father died also at the age of 102, and I was glad he lived that long. I hear a lot of this end of life discussion, and it bothers me somewhat, to be honest.
Your father's medical notes and his notebooks on some very famous patients were sort of like a treasure trove for you to piece together this personal history that had been off limits to you. And your mother, you recount, even at age 100, was telling stories about her childhood, their travels to Europe, your father's affairs, her own affairs. I mean, there is something about dementia where all social filters disappear. Have you come to the conclusion that most of our memories are revisionist history somewhat? And does it matter?
That wasn't so much my conclusion as the conclusion of scholars here at the psych department at Harvard, and some neuroscientists share this belief that our memories are not sort of stored away somewhere as if they were in a safe deposit box, and when we remember something, we simply make a withdrawal. Most of the cutting-edge scholars on this subject feel today that there is no storage box. That each time we remember something, were sort of recreating it out of bits and images and tiny pieces of memory in our somewhere in our mind, but essentially it's an act of reconstruction. And that worried me a bit. I got scared when I read that. I thought, uh-oh, here's a book based on my father's memories of his career, and then of my memories of his memories. I got worried. Have I got it wrong? But fortunately, he had left behind so many records, so much correspondence with other people, that I was able to check it all out, and it was almost all correct. I mean, he'd had fascinating medical cases. For many years, he treated our nation's greatest playwright, our Nobel laureate, Eugene O'Neill. Later, he became an expert court witness in the trial of Patricia Hearst. And still later, he helped to discover the man who was the Boston Strangler. I found him in a clinic, and he interviewed him at long length. And I have the tapes and the transcripts of all those interviews. He'd had a fascinating career, and I was glad at the end he was sitting there at his old office desk, still making memos to himself, even when they made no sense at all.
Let me just remind everyone online, if you have a question during the call, please press *3 on your phone, and by pressing *3, you'll be placed into the question queue. Have your question ready to share with a member of our staff, or if you're listening to us online, just type your question in the box provided. Jonathan, for those of us who have seen this disease up close and lived with it intimately, we all feel somewhat changed forever. Are you worried about your own mind?
Yes, of course, but since there's no certainty about, the degree, the likelihood of inheriting or whether you inherit some of the genes or not, there's no knowledge, no certainty about whether someone in that position will ever actually get Alzheimer's. And because my mother was so clear-headed right to the end, I don't dwell on that. I live in the present day. I'm planning 3 new books right now. But I did want to say one thing that troubled me was that I had a very hard time getting my father the medical attention he needed. His doctor, the doctor to whom I was advised to bring him, was almost never available. She very seldom answered phone calls. The companions who stayed with my father would call her when they were worried about something. And, they said she almost never call him back. They'd get a call back from someone else, an assistant or an assistant to an assistant. And they never knew whether their question had actually gotten to the doctor or not. Though it was a totally frustrating situation. And I think in part it's because there are so few people in the field of geriatrics. There's so few geriatricians being turned out by medical schools that the caseloads are tremendous. I don't know if other people have experienced that, but it certainly was very painful for me. And in a sense, the companions I hired became his real doctors.
Unfortunately, I think that is the shared experience by most of us who have had to fight for doctors' attention, care, diagnosis. But I was very touched by the homage that you give to your father's caregivers. And you talk about Sylvia as a ferocious champion and defender of your father's life, as long as any of the satisfactions she detected in him remained. So it was small sparks of humor, spirited resistance to demands she made, or simply a smile, which was all she asked for in exchange. This is not custodial care. This is special care. Can you describe the type of care that you valued that they gave your father?
Well, first of all, it was very affectionate. It wasn't it wasn't that plastic kind of friendliness that I don't know, people must learn about in training. You know, this is the way to talk to an Alzheimer's patient. Smile and say, "How are we feeling today?" No, it was none of that. It was, real conversation, and they loved sort of battling with him over things he said, and amazing. And they brought visitors there to spark his responses. Once Sylvia brought her husband up to visit, and this was like, when my father had Alzheimer's by now for almost 10 years, and her husband, Sylvia's husband, sat down next to Dad, and my father looked at him right away and said, "Sir, I think you're a gentleman." And I don't know what happened next, but I think Sylvia told me this. I think my father put his arm around Sylvia's waist because he really liked her. He was affectionate, and he's sort of hugging her slightly, and her husband joked and said, "Hey, watch out, that's my wife." And my father answered, "I guess he's not a gentleman after all." That was Sylvia's genius, was to bring life into his life.
They're very small victories, and they have to be honored and celebrated. I've always been distressed that Alzheimer's leaves such a gaping hole in the intergenerational narrative, that the stories don't get passed down because of the lack of ability to communicate from the grandparent to the grandchild. That lost connection, can you speak about that? Because you were able to find a way in to create the connective tissue.
Well, that's the thing. And of course, by writing this book, I hope to perpetuate a great deal of my father's legacy to the next generations. And the young physicians who are reading it now, getting a lot of emails from doctors, some of whom knew him in his prime when they were medical students. But the main thing is that I kept seeing, we were able to communicate somehow for a long, long time after he was diagnosed. It went on right through the time he was in the nursing home. Right up to the time when he asked me for the final time, "Are we going home? Are we going home now?" And I remember I said to him, "Yes, Daddy, this time we really are." I brought him home, and I remember how can I put it? There are a lot of people. I see this in the newspaper sometimes. Journalists in Boston said this recently. They say essentially that once a person has Alzheimer's, they become, quote, the stranger, the other, and lose all the elements of their personality that we knew and loved before. And as the journalist here in Boston wrote, pray for them to die as soon as possible. I never prayed for my father to die. I saw the resilience of his personality and his sweetness and his humor, and I'm glad he lived. I'm glad he lived a good old life, and he had a great appetite right up to the end.
I'm glad you shared that perspective, the purposefulness of giving someone you love giving dignity to their life. I think both sustains those very compassionate caregivers, and it's really somewhat descriptive of what you how you were able to connect with your father. If you don't mind, knowing what you know about Alzheimer's disease and your work with underserved children and families, I was alarmed, and I wanted your reaction, by statistics that in New York State alone, 23% of caregivers are under the age of 18. So we have children in the position of being caregivers, delinquent in school, stigma. Can you put that in a perspective since you spent your life in education and children?
Well, first of all, although I know some remarkable 18-year-olds who could possibly fill that role, overall, I have a strong belief that you need mature and wise people who have lived through difficult challenges themselves in life. So they're at least in middle-aged people in order to have any comprehension of what the patient is going through. But I would say there's one connection I would make between my father's situation and the 50 years that I've spent working with very low income Black and Hispanic children in New York and in Boston. It's this: when people ask, when any of us, I mean advocates for children like myself, when we go up to Congress and we say, you could prevent a lot of problems later on if you would give 3 full years of wonderful preschool to all the poorest children in America. And the members of Congress or Senate will typically say to me, that sounds very nice, but how much money will that actually save us later on? They want to know, if there's a cost benefit to doing this. And I always hate that question. I've said to them sometimes, forget about the economics. Why not give these children a chance to be happy before they die? And the same economic factor is in play with the elderly. No matter what, no matter what the integrity and decency of a doctor dealing with Alzheimer's patients, when they started talking to me about end-of-life possibilities and how, maybe he shouldn't live any longer, I always had this terrible feeling that they were trying to reconcile their sense of ethics with economic necessity. And that troubled me profoundly. As if they weren't saying this, but as if our society was saying, a 100-year-old neurologist isn't contributing to the national wealth. He's just using up our taxes, so why let him live? That's the feeling that I got.
I have been monopolizing your time. We want to open the lines to questions, and George is going to join. Perhaps about the father-son relationship, George?
Well, what's striking to me is how exceptional your father was, but how exceptional you were in your ability to continue that dialogue and that relationship for, I guess, 20 years from the time that he self-identified as having
Let's see, from 1992 to 2008. Yeah,
didn't you
close.
say that he had didn't you say he had identified even earlier?
That's right. So it's something like 18 years. That's right.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. We have a question here online from Jan, who says, what was the most surprising thing you learned in writing the book?
I think probably the most surprising thing I learned was when I looked back at notes that he'd been sending me while he was in the nursing home, which I'd filed away and then didn't discover until recently. I realized suddenly that at least through his 10th or 12th year of Alzheimer's, he kept on writing notes to me, and some of them, some of them were partly incomprehensible, but some had real, surprising, amazing cogency and clarity to them. For example, he wrote one note to me. It said, "Dear Jonathan, my son, someone we know has been extremely ill." He's still speaking as if he were the doctor watching himself. "Someone we know has recently been ill. Fate matters. Remember age and circumstance. Your one father." Daddy. Those things kept coming up. I think that's what surprised me most.
We have a question online from Anna Robles Rhodes, who says, I am on chapter 9 in your book. Love it, in capital letters with exclamation points. What advice would you give caregivers in terms of dealing with their doctors?
Good question. I'd give them the same advice that I was given when I had that long, frustrating period going on for years with his physician. People who were close to me. I grew up in Boston, and because of my father, I'd always sort of been part of the medical world in Boston. So I had a lot of acquaintances and in fairly high positions in this medical community. And one of them said to me, Jonathan, be respectful, because people who go into geriatrics, at least in the beginning, tend to do it out of a sense of ethics, out of morality. But when they get to the point where they can't give you any kind of continuous, decent medical care, you've got to be as tough with them as possible. He said, you have no alternative. Just keep advocating for your father, and don't let the dark intimidate you by silence. So I kept on doing that, and in the end, however, at the very end, I wasn't successful. At the very end, one of his helpers one day noticed, this when he was at home, noticed that he had a recurrence of a urinary infection, which is common among elderly people. She called the doctor's office, and the doctor finally called back, but she said she saw no reason to examine him, that just go to the drugstore and pick up a prescription, she called in. So they went across the street to the drugstore, picked up the prescription, gave it to him, and suddenly they looked at the label and they realized it was a medicine to which he was allergic and to which the doctor had told them he would have a bad reaction several years before. So the doctor inadvertently, I guess she just didn't check her records, and he immediately vomited hopelessly and then had a cardiac arrest and died. So that's how he died. Partly, I would say almost directly, because of medical negligence.
You spoke so lovingly of Sylvia in the book and on this phone call. Is this loving, affectionate, playful, intellectual relationship that she and your father developed, can you teach that? Can you educate people to be able to do that? Or is that something just in Sylvia's nature? And how in the hell did you find her?
Well, I found her actually through an agency, a small, unusual agency that somehow had a gift for locating unusually personable, likable, interesting people. Because one of the other helpers they found for my father was an artist who had wore a jaunty blue beret and had a wild sense of humor, which my father loved. Another was a doctor, a Cuban doctor, who hadn't yet gotten certified in the United States. And he would spend hours with my father when my father was flipping through neurology magazines, which kept coming in. My father would pick on a word, and he would talk with my father about it because he knew medical vocabulary. I'm not sure you can teach that. I just don't think anyone should be allowed to fill that role unless it's a really likable person, unless it's somebody that you or I would like to sit with on a cross-country flight instead of the person we would avoid. I'm not. I say the same thing with young children. Yes, we need teachers to be trained in education colleges, but still, I wouldn't allow anybody to go into the first grade unless that person is really likable and going to make the children smile.
Peggy Brick asks a question here online that relates to this. She says a continuing care retirement community can prepare all residents to relate to those with residents to relate to those with dementia. Have you seen any advantage in living in such a supportive community?
Well, I haven't personally, but I hear repeatedly from others that it's very good experience, especially if the retirement community is somehow attached to a nursing home, so that if one of the residents later needs to be hospitalized, it won't be an abrupt transition. But in my experience, I didn't see that. My mother and father had thought about moving to a residential, that kind of setting, but in the end, I'm not quite sure why, but both of them liked the idea of staying in their own home. My mother particularly. They lived in a high-rise building in Boston with windows that looked across. Anyone who knows Boston will know this is a famous river here that separates Boston from the universities in Cambridge. Dad, sitting at that desk in the end, could look across the river and see the university where he was educated. I'm glad they made the choice they did.
Jonathan, I wanted to ask, there's a movement in Europe coming our way, and actually it was just announced at the White House Conference on Aging, about initiatives in 6 states to become dementia-friendly. What, in your view, would it take for communities to become dementia-friendly? What might it look like?
Well, at least in the early stages of dementia, when a person is still, out in the world, just, beginning to have difficulties, I think it's just a matter of educating the public in respectfulness, in respecting the dignity of every human being, no matter how they falter, no matter how they might go into a bookstore and ask for a book and seem confused and pick the wrong title, that kind of thing. But I think the best thing those states can do to be dementia-friendly is to work with their medical schools, work with the major medical schools to entice more and more people to come into the field. Young physicians, I'm told this by doctors, young physicians don't want to go into geriatrics because the pay scale is so low. They can make far more money in almost every other specialty. In the long run, I'm afraid money talks. Maybe those states can work with the medical schools. Maybe the states can provide some incentives, cash incentives, like loan forgiveness to those medical students who do go into this field.
It's an excellent suggestion. We've got a caller from Charmin Walker. Ms. Walker, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Are you there?
Yes,
we are.
Okay. Yes. My mother was diagnosed 1 year ago in April, and she, over the last couple of months, have gotten progressively worse every day. Is there anything that you can take to slow down the progression of memory loss?
I was assured by the specialist in Boston, to my turn, that at that time, that was like 10 years, 15 years ago, there was no medication or treatment that could slow down the loss of memory, except that I was told, and I kind of believe that the only way you can slow down the loss of memory sometimes is by keeping the patient's mind as active as possible. But in your case, it sounds as though you're at a point where that's really difficult. Do I understand correctly?
That is correct. And the medication.
I think it's possible that MERYL will have a better answer to that than I do, but I do know now cutting-edge doctors are talking about possible ways to slow down or postpone, to delay the onset of complete dementia, or maybe even to delay the onset of any dementia. But I'm not certain of that, and I think that's all in the experimental phase, unless MERYL knows more than I on that subject.
Let me deal with the immediacy of your challenge. My best advice is, unfortunately, there is no disease-modifying therapy, only things that are symptomatic. From my own experience, go with them. Don't try to hold on to what was in the disease or where they were, and try to stay with them in the moment. It will be very challenging. It's a very tricky space. But for your own health and state of mind, go with them.
I like that advice.
It sounded like you stayed with your father every moment, and it's quite extraordinary.
Well, I couldn't do it constantly. There were, as you'll see in the book, as you've seen, there were moments when I'm in public life somewhat because of my books on children have been in schools like Amazing Grace and Savage Inequalities have been national bestsellers. So sometimes I had to go away to California to lecture or to New York for a conference. And but once he had Alzheimer's, I tried to set aside entire periods of months where I wouldn't interrupt, so I could see him with great continuity. I found that was terribly important.
But what I guess I was going to emphasize was how much you stayed with him at every stage. You dealt with him as he could be. As his mind went, you went with it, and you picked up on words or phrases that triggered things with him. And it just is a remarkable sort of expression both ways of love, his for you and you for him.
Thank you.
Jonathan, wow. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for being with us. And we'd encourage everyone on the phone to read his book, The Theft of Memory, Losing My Father One Day at a Time.